The shovel scraped against the hard Virginia clay as 15-year-old Dinah Green worked through the darkness, sweat dripping down her face despite the cool summer night. Below her in the freshly dug pit, Lawrence Fletcher's muffled screams grew weaker with each shovelful of earth she threw down. His eyes, wide with terror and confusion from the laudanum still clouding his mind, stared up at her through the growing darkness as dirt began to cover his face. She had endured his assaults for the last time, and tonight the master's heir would pay the price beneath the ancient oak tree that had witnessed generations of suffering on Fletcher Plantation. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Dinah Green began not with violence, but with loss. Born in 1825, to a mother she would barely remember. Dinah's earliest memories were fragmented images of a woman's gentle hands braiding her hair, a soft voice singing spirituals in the quarters after dark, and then nothing but the cold reality of being raised by the collective hands of enslaved women who had their own children to care for. Her mother, Rose, had died when Dinah was only 3 years old, collapsing in the cotton fields during a particularly brutal harvest season. The overseers had not even allowed the other enslaved people to carry her body back to the quarters until the day's work was finished, leaving her small form covered with burlap sacks between the rows of white balls that seemed to mock her sacrifice with their pristine beauty. Dinah grew up in the shadow of the Fletcher family's grand mansion, a white column structure that lorded over 300 acres of Virginia tobacco and cotton fields. The plantation had been in the Fletcher family since 1768, built on land taken from indigenous peoples and cultivated by the forced labor of hundreds of African souls over 3 generations. By 1840, when Dinah's story reached its terrible climax, the plantation housed 47 enslaved people, each one a cog in the machine that generated wealth for the Fletcher family while receiving nothing but suffering in return. The Fletcher family consisted of Master Robert Fletcher, a portly man of 52 with a red face that grew redder with each glass of bourbon he consumed, his wife Constance, a thin woman who spent her days directing the household slaves with a voice like cracking ice, and their only child, Lawrence. Lawrence Fletcher was 23 years old in 1840, a young man who had grown up believing that everything on the plantation, including the people, belonged to him to use as he pleased. He had his father's build, already running to fat despite his youth, and his mother's cold eyes that seemed to look through enslaved people as if they were furniture or livestock. Dinah had worked in the fields until she turned 12, her small hands becoming calloused and scarred from picking tobacco leaves and cotton under the brutal Virginia sun. The overseers had watched her development with the calculating eyes of men who saw human beings as assets to be managed, noting when her body began to change from child to woman. In 1837, when Dinah was 12 years old, Constance Fletcher had decided that the girl was suitable for housework, pulling her from the fields to work in the main house, alongside 6 other enslaved people who cooked, cleaned, and attended to the family's every need. Life in the main house was different from the fields, in ways both better and worse. The work was less physically demanding, though no less exhausting, involving endless hours of cooking, cleaning, serving meals, and attending to the Fletcher family's comfort. Dinah learned to move silently through the grand rooms, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make herself invisible except when her service was required. She learned which floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked, and how to navigate the house in the dark during those nights when the family called for service at odd hours. But working in the main house also meant closer proximity to the Fletcher family, particularly to Lawrence, who had returned from 2 years at the College of William and Mary with what he considered refined manners, but what was really just a veneer of education over the same brutal entitlement he had always possessed. He had noticed Dinah almost immediately upon his return in 1838, his eyes following her as she served dinner, as she carried laundry, as she cleaned the rooms. At first it was just looks, the kind of predatory attention that made Dinah's skin crawl and set her heart racing with fear. The first assault came in the spring of 1839, 3 months after Lawrence's return. Dinah had been cleaning the library, dusting the hundreds of books that the Fletcher family kept more for show than reading, when Lawrence had entered and locked the door behind him. She had tried to leave, tried to maintain the invisible wall that enslaved people erected to protect themselves. But there was nowhere to go, and no one to help. When it was over and Lawrence had straightened his clothes and left as if nothing had happened, Dinah had remained on the library floor, staring at the leather-bound volumes that contained all the knowledge of the civilized world but none of its mercy. She had told no one, because there was no one to tell. Master Robert would never believe a slave girl's word over his son's, and even if he did, Lawrence's crime was not considered a crime at all under the laws that governed Virginia in 1839. Constance Fletcher would more likely blame Dinah for tempting her precious son than offer any protection. The other enslaved people in the quarters could offer sympathy and shared rage, but no real solutions. This was the reality of enslavement, where black women's bodies were considered property that white men could use at will. The assaults continued throughout 1839 and into 1840, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes more frequently depending on Lawrence's whims. Dinah learned to recognize the signs, the way his eyes would fix on her during dinner service, the particular tone of voice when he summoned her to clean a room he was occupying. She learned to mentally separate herself from her body during these violations, to float somewhere above herself and focus on small details like the pattern of cracks in the ceiling or the sound of birds outside the window. It was the only way to survive with her mind intact, but survival took its toll. Dinah found herself withdrawing from the other enslaved people, unable to participate in the small joys they carved out for themselves in the quarters. The singing and storytelling and moments of laughter that were acts of resistance against their conditions. She stopped eating properly, her body shrinking until Constance Fletcher complained that she looked unwell and ordered her to eat more so as not to be unsightly when serving guests. Sleep became impossible without nightmares, and Dinah would often wake in the darkness of the quarters, biting her hand to keep from screaming and disturbing the others who needed their rest before another day of forced labor. In the quarters, there was an older woman named Ruth who had survived 40 years of enslavement through a combination of cunning, strength, and an encyclopedic knowledge of herbs and plants that she had learned from her African-born grandmother. Ruth had noticed Dinah's deterioration, had seen it before in other young women who had caught the attention of white men on the plantation. She began sitting with Dinah in the evenings, not asking questions but simply being present, a silent acknowledgement of suffering and survival. It was Ruth who eventually spoke the words that would set everything in motion. One evening in late June of 1840, as they sat outside the quarters watching the fireflies dance in the humid air, Ruth had said quietly, "Sometimes a body got to do terrible things to survive. Sometimes the only way to stop a wolf is to kill it." She had not looked at Dinah when she spoke, her eyes fixed on the distant oak tree that stood at the edge of the main yard, its massive branches spreading like dark fingers against the twilight sky. That oak tree was ancient, possibly 200 years old, a silent witness to generations of cruelty enacted on the plantation. Enslaved people had been whipped beneath its branches, had been sold away from their families in its shade, had died in its shadow. There were stories told in the quarters about the tree, whispered tales of spirits that lived in its roots, of justice that would one day come from the earth itself. Some of the older enslaved people claimed they could hear singing coming from the tree on certain nights, the voices of those who had suffered and died crying out for vengeance. Dinah had begun to watch Lawrence with new eyes after Ruth's words, no longer seeing him as an unstoppable force, but as a man with vulnerabilities that could be exploited. She observed his habits, noting that he drank heavily most evenings, that he often took laudanum to sleep after his drinking, that he was careless and confident in his movements around the plantation because he had never had reason to fear consequences. She began to plan, not consciously at first, but in the back of her mind, where desperate ideas took root and grew. The laudanum was kept in the main house medicine cabinet, a tincture of opium that doctors prescribed for everything from headaches to consumption. Constance Fletcher used it frequently for her nervous complaints, and there were always several bottles in supply. Dinah knew where the key to the medicine cabinet was kept, had seen Constance retrieve it dozens of times when she needed her medicine. It would be simple to take a bottle, to hide it among her few possessions in the quarters, to wait for the right moment. That moment came on a Thursday evening in July of 1840. Master Robert had left that morning for Richmond on business, a trip that would keep him away for 3 days. Constance Fletcher had retired early with one of her headaches, taking a large dose of laudanum herself and instructing the household slaves not to disturb her until morning. Lawrence had spent the evening drinking brandy in the library, and Dinah knew from experience that he would soon come looking for her. She had prepared everything earlier that day, moving through her tasks with mechanical precision while her mind raced through the plan again and again. She had taken the bottle of laudanum that morning, slipping it into her apron pocket when Constance was distracted. She had checked the shed where the plantation's tools were kept, locating a shovel and making note of exactly where it stood. She had walked past the oak tree 3 times during the day, studying the ground around it and finding a spot where the earth looked softer, more recently disturbed, perhaps where roots had been cut or where previous digging had been. Loosen the soil. When Lawrence summoned her to the library that evening, ringing the bell that called slaves to service, Dinah went with her heart hammering in her chest, but her face carefully blank. She found him sprawled in his father's favorite chair, his cravat loosened, and his face flushed with drink. The familiar predatory look was in his eyes as he ordered her to bring him more brandy, and she knew what would follow. Dinah went to the sideboard where the crystal decanters were kept and poured brandy into Lawrence's glass, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her body. This was the moment everything depended on, the moment that would either free her or damn her. She pulled the small bottle of laudanum from her pocket, unstoppered it with hands that barely trembled, and poured a generous amount into the brandy. The laudanum mixed with the amber liquid, invisible to casual observation, a deadly promise dissolved in expensive spirits. She brought the glass to Lawrence, setting it on the table beside him, and stepping back to wait. He took a long drink without looking at her, his attention on a book of poetry he was pretending to read. Dinah stood silently, watching as he finished the glass and set it down, watching as he began to show the first signs of the drug's effects. His eyelids grew heavy, his movements became slower, and his speech began to slur when he ordered her to come closer. But instead of the assault Dinah had endured so many times before, Lawrence's body began to fail him. The laudanum, mixed with the alcohol already in his system, was taking hold faster than she had anticipated. He tried to stand, and stumbled, confusion crossing his face as his legs refused to obey. He looked at Dinah with eyes that were already glazing over, and perhaps in that moment some part of him understood what was happening. But the drug was too strong, and his comprehension too slow. Lawrence collapsed back into the chair, his body going limp as the laudanum overwhelmed his system. He was not unconscious, but deeply sedated, aware of his surroundings, but unable to move or speak clearly. Dinah stood over him, looking down at the man who had violated her repeatedly, who had stolen her dignity and her peace and her sense of safety in the world. She felt no triumph in this moment, only a grim determination to finish what she had started. The main house was silent around her. Constance Fletcher drugged in her own bed upstairs. The other household slaves dismissed to the quarters for the night. Dinah knew she had to move quickly, had to complete her plan before the laudanum wore off, or before someone discovered what was happening. She checked the hallway to ensure she was alone, then returned to Lawrence's slumped form and began the difficult task of moving him. Lawrence was not a small man, and his drugged body was dead weight that Dinah's small frame struggled to manage. She got her arms under his shoulders and dragged him from the chair, his boots scraping across the polished floor as she pulled him toward the library door. The journey through the house was agonizing, every few feet requiring her to stop and rest, to listen for any sound that might indicate someone was awake. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked loudly, marking each second of her crime, each moment she spent dragging the heir of Fletcher plantation toward his doom. She managed to get Lawrence to the back door of the house, then out onto the porch and down the steps into the yard. The summer night was warm and humid, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and tobacco plants. Cicadas sang in the darkness, their rhythmic chorus providing cover for the sounds of Dinah's labored breathing and Lawrence's body being dragged across the grass. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see by, but also making her visible to anyone who might look out from the quarters or the house. The oak tree stood perhaps 50 yards from the back of the house, a massive presence in the darkness, with branches that spread wide enough to shade a considerable portion of the yard. Dinah dragged Lawrence toward it, her muscles burning with the effort, sweat soaking through her dress despite the relative coolness of the night air. Lawrence moaned occasionally, sounds of confusion and distress that chilled Dinah's blood, but the laudanum kept him from crying out or struggling effectively. When she reached the oak tree, Dinah let Lawrence's body drop to the ground and ran to the tool shed to retrieve the shovel she had marked earlier. Her hands were shaking now, the reality of what she was doing crashing over her in waves of terror and determination. She was going to kill Lawrence Fletcher, was going to murder the master's son, a crime that would result in her own death if discovered. But the alternative was to continue suffering his assaults, to live in constant fear, to be less than human in a world that already denied her humanity at every turn. The ground beneath the oak tree was indeed softer than the surrounding earth, and Dinah began to dig with desperate energy. The shovel bit into the soil, each scoop bringing her closer to creating Lawrence's grave. She dug frantically, knowing that time was her enemy, that Lawrence might rouse enough to cry for help, that someone might wake and discover his absence. The hole grew deeper, 2 feet, then 3 feet, then 4 feet into the earth. It was not a proper grave, not deep enough to prevent discovery forever, but it would have to suffice. Lawrence had begun to stir more actively now, the effects of the laudanum slowly wearing off as his body metabolized the drug. His eyes were more focused, and he was trying to speak, slurred words that might have been pleas, or threats, or simply confusion. Dinah ignored him, continuing to dig until she had a pit approximately 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 5 feet deep. It was enough. It would have to be enough. She set the shovel aside and returned to Lawrence, grabbing him under the arms once more, and dragging him toward the edge of the pit. He was heavier now that he was beginning to struggle weakly, his body fighting against the drug and against her efforts to move him. She positioned him at the edge of the hole. Then, with a final effort, she pushed him in. Lawrence fell into the pit with a heavy thud, landing on his back in the dirt at the bottom. Dinah stood at the edge of the grave, looking down at Lawrence Fletcher as he stared up at her. He was awake enough now to understand what was happening, and terror filled his eyes as he tried to move, tried to climb out of the hole his weakened body could not escape. He opened his mouth to scream, but Dinah quickly grabbed the shovel and began throwing dirt into the pit. The first shovelful hit Lawrence's chest, and his scream turned into a choked gasp as earth filled his mouth. This was the moment that would haunt Dinah for the rest of her life. The moment when Lawrence Fletcher realized he was being buried alive and began to fight with the strength of pure panic. His hands clawed at the sides of the pit, trying to find purchase to pull himself up, but the earth was loose and gave way under his fingers. His muffled screams were terrible to hear, sounds of animal terror that cut through the night air. Dinah forced herself to continue shoveling, to keep throwing dirt into the hole even as Lawrence thrashed and struggled beneath the growing layer of earth. The dirt began to cover Lawrence's body, first his legs and torso, then rising to his chest and neck. He was using all his remaining strength to keep his face clear, twisting his head back and forth to avoid the falling earth. But there was too much, and it kept coming. Dinah's arms ached with the effort of shoveling, her whole body trembling with exertion and horror at what she was doing. But she could not stop now. To stop would be to fail, to leave Lawrence alive, to tell what had happened, to ensure her own death by torture. Lawrence's screams grew weaker as dirt filled his mouth and nose, as the weight of the earth compressed his chest and made breathing impossible. His hands, which had been reaching desperately toward the surface, began to slow their movements, fingers curling and uncurling in the soil. Dinah could see his eyes through the thin layer of dirt that covered his face, wide and white with terror, staring up at her with an accusation that would follow her into eternity. She threw another shovelful of dirt, and then another, and then Lawrence's movements stopped. His hands went still, his body ceased its thrashing, and the terrible sounds that had been emerging from the pit fell silent. Dinah stood frozen for a moment, shovel in hand, staring at the partially filled grave. Lawrence Fletcher was dead, suffocated beneath the Virginia soil, buried alive under the ancient oak tree that had witnessed so much suffering. But there was no time to process what had happened, no time for the horror and guilt and relief to fully register. Dinah returned to shoveling with mechanical efficiency, filling in the rest of the hole until the ground was level again. She tamped down the earth with her feet and the back of the shovel, then scattered leaves and debris across the disturbed soil to disguise the fresh grave. In the darkness, it looked almost natural, just a slightly bare patch beneath the oak tree that might have been caused by the tree's dense shade preventing grass from growing. Dinah returned the shovel to the tool shed, wiping it clean of dirt with her apron and placing it exactly where she had found it. Then she went to the well and drew water, washing her hands and face and trying to clean the worst of the dirt from her dress. Her body was shaking uncontrollably now, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the murder beginning to fade and leave her weak and nauseated. She splashed cold water on her face again and again, as if she could wash away what she had done, along with the dirt and sweat. She returned to the main house through the back door, moving through the silent rooms like a ghost. The library still showed signs of the evening's events, the empty brandy glass on the table, the chair where Lawrence had sat before the laudanum took hold. Dinah cleaned everything with shaking hands, washing the glass 3 times to ensure no trace of the drug remained, straightening the chair and the books, making the room look as if Lawrence had simply been reading and then left. The bottle of laudanum she took with her back to the quarters, hiding it beneath the loose floorboard under her sleeping pallet, where she kept her few personal possessions. A broken comb that had been her mother's, a smooth stone from the Sia River, a scrap of blue fabric she had found and treasured for its color. She lay down on her pallet, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling while around her, the other enslaved people slept, unaware of what had transpired in the night. Sleep did not come for Dinah that night. She lay rigid on her pallet, listening to the sounds of the quarters, the breathing of the other enslaved people, the creaking of the building, the night sounds from outside. Every noise made her heart race with fear that someone had discovered Lawrence's body, that overseers were coming to drag her to face justice. But the night remained quiet, and when dawn began to break, bringing the gray light of morning through the cracks in the walls, no alarm had been raised. The morning routine began as it always did, with the enslaved people rising before the sun to begin their daily labor. Dinah moved through her tasks like a sleepwalker, going to the main house to help prepare breakfast, to set the table for the Fletcher family's morning meal. Constance Fletcher appeared at her usual time, still groggy from her laudanum-induced sleep, and immediately asked where Lawrence was. Dinah, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her, said she had not seen him that morning. A search was organized when Lawrence did not appear for breakfast, a rare occurrence for a young man who enjoyed his meals. The house was checked first, then the grounds, then the fields where Lawrence sometimes rode to observe the enslaved people at work. By midday, when there was still no sign of him, Constance Fletcher was working herself into hysterics and demanding that all the enslaved people be questioned. Master Robert was sent for, a messenger riding hard to Richmond to bring him home with news of his son's disappearance. Dinah was questioned along with all the other household slaves. Each one asked when they had last seen Lawrence and if they knew anything about his whereabouts. Dinah repeated her story, that she had last seen him in the library the evening before, when she had served him brandy, that he had dismissed her and she had gone to the quarters for the night. The overseer who questioned her was suspicious of all enslaved people on principle, but Dinah was just one small girl among many suspects, and she had been a household slave for years with no history of trouble. The days that followed Lawrence's disappearance were tense and frightening for everyone on the plantation. Constance Fletcher alternated between convinced certainty that her son had been murdered by the enslaved people and desperate hope that he had simply ridden off somewhere and would return. Slave patrols were organized to search the surrounding countryside to check if any enslaved people from the plantation or neighboring properties had fled, thinking that perhaps Lawrence had been killed and his body hidden crow. During an escape attempt, Master Robert returned from Richmond in a fury of grief and anger, immediately ordering that the enslaved people be interrogated more harshly. Several of the men from the fields were whipped on suspicion, their backs opened with the lash as the overseers demanded information about Lawrence's fate. But no one knew anything, because no one except Dinah knew what had really happened, and she maintained her innocent ignorance while watching the torture of her fellow enslaved people with guilt and horror. The oak tree sat undisturbed through all of this, its massive presence so familiar that no one thought to examine the ground beneath it closely. The disturbed earth had been obscured by Dinah's careful covering, and the tree's dense shade meant that the grass around it was naturally sparse anyway. Lawrence Fletcher's body rested 5 feet beneath the surface, undiscovered, and beginning the slow process of decay in the Virginia soil. Weeks passed, then months, and Lawrence Fletcher's disappearance remained a mystery. Constance Fletcher held on to hope that her son would return, that he had suffered some accident that had stolen his memory, and he was wandering somewhere, waiting to be found and brought home. Master Robert, more pragmatic, had begun to accept that his son was likely dead, though the lack of a body prevented him from fully mourning. The plantation settled into a new routine, one where Lawrence's absence was a constant presence, a mystery that haunted the Fletcher family and kept the enslaved people under constant suspicion. Dinah found that she could not fully escape what she had done, even as the immediate danger of discovery faded. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares, where Lawrence's dirt-covered face stared up at her, where his muffled screams echoed endlessly, where she could feel the weight of the shovel in her hands as she buried him alive. She would wake gasping and terrified, covered in sweat, and have to remind herself that she had survived, that she had ended the assaults, that the price of her freedom from Lawrence's violence had been his life. Ruth, the older woman from the quarters, never asked Dinah directly if she knew what had happened to Lawrence, but there was a knowing look in her eyes sometimes, a recognition that passed between them without words. Ruth had suggested that sometimes terrible things had to be done to survive, and perhaps she understood that Dinah had taken that lesson to heart. But she said nothing, and Dinah was grateful for the silence that protected them both. Strange stories began to circulate in the quarters about the oak tree, stories that grew with each telling until they took on the quality of legend. Some of the enslaved people claimed they heard sounds coming from the tree at night, a voice crying out from beneath the ground, or singing, a low, mournful sound that seemed to rise from the roots themselves. Others reported seeing lights beneath the tree, small flickering glows that appeared and disappeared like fireflies, but moved in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be insects. Dinah heard these stories with a mixture of terror and fascination, wondering if they were true or if they were simply the product of frightened imaginations in a place where fear was a constant companion. She avoided the oak tree when she could, taking longer paths to reach the main house rather than walking past its spreading branches. But sometimes she could not avoid it, and when she had to walk beneath those ancient limbs, she felt as if the tree was watching her, as if it knew what rested beneath its roots, and was waiting to reveal her secret. The overseer, a cruel man named Briggs, who took pleasure in the suffering of the enslaved people, became convinced that Lawrence had been killed by one of the field hands and that the body had been hidden somewhere on the plantation. He conducted periodic searches, ordering the enslaved people to dig in various locations, to check the barn and the outbuildings, to drain the pond at the edge of the property. But he never ordered anyone to dig beneath the oak tree. That ancient presence was too established, too much a part of the plantation's landscape to seem like a hiding place. 2 years passed, and life on the plantation continued its brutal routine. Dinah turned 17 and found that the absence of Lawrence's assaults had allowed her to begin healing in small ways. She reconnected with the other enslaved people in the quarters, participating again in the singing and storytelling that helped them maintain their humanity in the face of their bondage. She worked her tasks in the main house with the same efficiency she always had, but now without the constant dread of Lawrence's attention. But the oak tree continued to be a source of strange occurrences that the enslaved people whispered about. A young field hand named Jacob swore he had seen Lawrence Fletcher's ghost walking toward the oak tree one evening at dusk, his form translucent and covered in dirt. An older woman named Patience claimed that she had been walking past the tree at night and had heard a voice calling for help from underground, though when she stopped to listen more closely, there was only silence. Master Robert, his grief turning to obsession, brought in a man from Richmond who claimed to be able to communicate with the dead, hoping to discover what had happened to his son. The medium, a theatrical man named Aldridge who charged an exorbitant fee for his services, conducted a séance in the main house, gathering the Fletcher family and several trusted neighbors to attempt contact with Curd, Lawrence's spirit. Dinah served refreshments at this gathering, listening as Aldridge claimed to feel Lawrence's presence, to sense that he was trying to communicate something about the grounds of the plantation. The séance resulted in nothing concrete, just Aldridge's vague pronouncements that Lawrence's spirit was troubled and could not rest until his body was found and properly buried. But it was enough to reinvigorate Master Robert's search, and he ordered new excavations around the plantation, digging in locations that the medium suggested might hold answers. The enslaved people were forced to spend days digging holes and filling them in again, searching for a body that lay undiscovered beneath the oak tree while they searched everywhere else. Dinah watched these searches with her heart in her throat, terrified that someone would eventually think to dig beneath the oak tree, but also darkly amused that they could walk past Lawrence's grave daily and never recognize it. The tree seemed to protect its secret, its massive roots and dense shade, making the ground beneath it seem like an unlikely place to hide anything. And so Lawrence Fletcher remained buried, his body slowly returning to the earth that had sustained his family's wealth for generations. In the fall of 1842, a terrible storm swept through Virginia, one of the worst in memory. Wind and rain battered the plantation for 2 days, flooding the fields and damaging several of the outbuildings. The oak tree, which had stood for 2 centuries through countless storms, lost one of its major branches, a massive limb that cracked and fell during the height of the tempest. The branch fell away from the main house, crashing down in the yard and narrowly missing the quarters. When the storm cleared and the enslaved people were sent to clean up the damage, they found that the fallen branch had torn a section of earth when it fell, its roots pulling up soil and exposing what lay beneath. There, in the disturbed ground, were fragments of cloth and something that looked disturbingly like human bone. The discovery was reported immediately to Master Robert, and within hours, the area beneath the oak tree was being carefully excavated by the overseers. The skeleton that emerged from the earth was identified by the remains of clothing and personal effects as Lawrence Fletcher. The mystery of his disappearance was solved, though the mystery of how he came to be buried beneath the oak tree remained. The body's positioning suggested that he had been buried alive, the bones of his hands raised toward the surface as if he had been trying to claw his way out. The revelation was horrifying to the Fletcher family and to the neighbors who gathered to view the grim discovery. Dinah watched from a distance as Lawrence's remains were removed from the ground, her face carefully blank despite the terror racing through her heart. The discovery of the body would lead to new investigations, new questions, new searches for the truth. She knew that she should feel guilt or remorse, but what she felt instead was a grim satisfaction that Lawrence had been found in a state that revealed his fear and suffering, a small measure of justice for what he had done to her. The investigation that followed was intense, with Master Robert determined to find who had murdered his son. Every enslaved person on the plantation was questioned again, more harshly this time now that there was evidence of murder rather than just disappearance. Dinah was questioned for hours, the overseer Briggs trying every intimidation tactic he knew to force a confession from her or anyone else who might have information. But Dinah held to her story, the same one she had told for more than 2 years. She had last seen Lawrence in the library, had served him brandy, had been dismissed to the quarters. She knew nothing about how he had ended up buried beneath the oak tree. Her story had the benefit of being mostly true, and there was no evidence to connect her to the murder beyond the timing of his disappearance. Many enslaved people had access to the main house and grounds. Any one of them could theoretically have killed Lawrence. The Fletcher family buried Lawrence's remains in the family plot with great ceremony, a funeral that drew people from across the county to mourn the young man who had died so mysteriously and violently. Reverend Michael spoke of Lawrence's virtues, painting a picture of a fine young man cut down in his prime by some unknown villain. Dinah stood with the other household slaves at the back of the funeral gathering, watching this sanitized version of Lawrence Fletcher being presented to the world, and she had to bite her tongue to keep from laughing at the absurdity of it. The investigation eventually stalled, as there was simply no evidence pointing to any particular person. Master Robert offered a reward for information leading to the killer's identification, but no one came forward because no one except Dinah knew the truth. The plantation settled back into its routine once more, though the story of Lawrence Fletcher's mysterious murder became a tale told throughout the region, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Ruth died in the winter of 1843, succumbing to pneumonia after decades of hard labor had weakened her body beyond its ability to fight the illness. Dinah sat with her in her final hours, holding the old woman's hand as she struggled to breathe. Ruth's last words to Dinah were spoken in a whisper that barely carried over the sound of her labored breathing. "You did what you had to do, child. Don't let it poison what's left of your life. Some wolves need killing." Those words stayed with Dinah as the years passed, and the plantation continued its operations under Master Robert's increasingly erratic management. Constance Fletcher had never recovered from the loss of her son, spending more and more time in her room with her laudanum, fading slowly away from life. Master Robert drank more heavily, his face growing redder and his temper shorter, taking out his grief and rage on the enslaved people who worked his land. The oak tree remained standing, its missing branch leaving a scar on its trunk but not diminishing its imposing presence. The stories about the tree continued and grew more elaborate, with people from neighboring plantations coming to see the infamous oak beneath which the Fletcher heir had been buried alive. Some claimed they could still hear sounds coming from the tree, singing or crying that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. Dinah wondered sometimes if these sounds were real, if Lawrence's spirit truly was trapped beneath the tree, or if they were simply the product of guilty consciences and fearful imaginations. In 1847, when Dinah was 22 years old, Master Robert Fletcher died of a stroke. His body giving out after years of alcohol and grief had weakened it. Constance followed him within a month, her heart simply stopping one night as she slept in her laudanum haze. The plantation passed to a distant cousin, a man named William Fletcher from South Carolina who had never met Lawrence and had no personal investment in solving the mystery of his death. William Fletcher was a businessman more interested in profit than revenge, and he made changes to the plantation immediately upon taking possession. Some enslaved people were sold to settle the estate's debts, others were redistributed to different work assignments based on William's assessment of maximum efficiency. Dinah found herself sold to a family in North Carolina, separated from the only home she had known and the tree that held her terrible secret. The journey to North Carolina was brutal, a forced march in chains with a dozen other enslaved people who had been sold to various buyers. Dinah carried with her only the clothes on her back and the memories of what she had done, the weight of Lawrence Fletcher's death, a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. As the wagon carried her away from Fletcher Plantation, she looked back one last time at the oak tree standing in the distance, its branches spread against the sky like a monument to her crime and her survival. Life in North Carolina brought new hardships and new cruelties, but also a strange sense of freedom from the constant reminder of what she had done. The Garrett family who purchased her were tobacco farmers with a medium-sized operation, nothing like the grand plantation she had left behind. She worked in their fields and their home, enduring the same degradations that all enslaved people suffered, but without the specific horror of Lawrence Fletcher's assaults. Years passed, and the country moved closer to the conflict that would eventually tear it apart. Dinah heard whispers of abolition, of growing tensions between North and South, of the possibility that the institution of slavery might one day end. These whispers gave her something she had not had in years, a small flame of hope that perhaps she might live to see freedom, that the suffering she had endured and the terrible things she had done might one day be understood in the context of a system so evil that it drove people to desperate acts. In 1859, when Dinah was 34 years old, she encountered a traveling preacher who was secretly part of the Underground Railroad. This man, who called himself Brother Paul, spoke in coded language about the River Jordan and crossing over to freedom, messages that the enslaved people understood, even if their masters did not. He sought out Dinah specifically after hearing from another enslaved person that she had a strength about her, a quality of survival that suggested she might be willing to risk everything for freedom. Brother Paul offered Dinah a chance to escape, to follow the North Star to free states where slavery was illegal. It was a dangerous proposition, one that could result in death if she was caught. But Dinah had faced death before and survived. She thought of Lawrence Fletcher buried beneath the oak tree, of the terror in his eyes as the earth covered his face, and she realized that she had already done the hardest thing she would ever have to do. Escape, however dangerous, could not be worse than what she had already endured and committed. The night Dinah fled the Garrett farm was moonless and quiet, the darkness her ally as she slipped away from the slave quarters and into the woods beyond. Brother Paul had given her directions to the first safe house, a Quaker family who would hide her and pass her along to the next station on the Underground Railroad. She traveled by night and hid during the day, moving through the North Carolina wilderness with the constant fear of discovery driving her forward. The journey to freedom took 3 months, a harrowing passage through safe houses and dangerous crossings, always moving north toward the promise of states where she would be legally free. Dinah was helped by abolitionists of both races, people who risked their own safety to aid escaping enslaved people. She heard stories from other fugitives she met along the way, tales of families separated, of brutal punishments, of the desperate desire for freedom that drove people to risk everything. Dinah reached Pennsylvania in the winter of 1860, crossing the border into a free state with a sense of disbelief that freedom was actually possible. She settled in Philadelphia, finding work as a domestic servant in the home of a Quaker family who asked no questions about her past. For the first time in her life, she received wages for her labor, money that was hers to keep and spend as she chose. The concept was almost incomprehensible after a lifetime of forced labor. The Quaker family, the Williamson household, were kind employers who treated Dinah with a respect she had never experienced before. Mrs. Williamson was an active abolitionist who hosted meetings in her home, gatherings where formerly enslaved people told their stories to sympathetic audiences who donated money to the cause of abolition. Mrs. Williamson encouraged Dinah to speak at these meetings, to share her experiences of slavery with people who needed to understand the reality of the institution. Dinah was reluctant at first, fearful of revealing too much about her past, of somehow exposing what she had done to Lawrence Fletcher. But as she listened to other formerly enslaved people speak of the violence and degradation they had suffered, she realized that her story was not unique in its horror, only in its specific details. She began to speak at the meetings, telling carefully edited versions of her experiences, describing the assaults she had endured without mentioning how they had ended. The audiences at these abolitionist meetings were shocked and moved by Dinah's testimony, by her descriptions of life on a Virginia plantation and the systematic dehumanization that slavery enacted on its victims. Some people wept openly as she spoke. Others sat in stunned silence, confronting perhaps for the first time the human cost of the institution that enriched the South. Dinah found a strange power in telling her story, in transforming her suffering into testimony that might help end the system that had caused it. In 1861, the war came. The tensions between North and South finally erupted into armed conflict, and the question of slavery became central to the national struggle. Dinah followed the news of the war with intense interest, learning to read with the help of Mrs. Williamson so that she could consume newspaper accounts of battles and political developments. Each Union victory felt personal, a step toward the destruction of the institution that had defined and destroyed so much of her life. As the war progressed and it became clear that the Union intended to end slavery, Dinah began to think more about what she had done to Lawrence Fletcher. In the context of a nation at war over the question of human bondage, her act of desperate violence seemed different than it had in the moment. She had killed a man who was assaulting her, who was using the power of slavery to violate her repeatedly with no fear of consequences. In a just world, she would have been defending herself. In the world of slavery, she had been committing murder. The Emancipation Proclamation came in 1863, declaring enslaved people in rebellious states to be free. Dinah wept when she heard the news, overwhelmed by the reality that the institution that had enslaved her was finally being dismantled by law and force of arms. She thought of the people she had left behind on Fletcher Plantation, wondered if they were still alive, if they had heard that they were free, if they believed it or thought it was just another cruel trick by the masters. After the war ended in 1865, Dinah made a decision that surprised even herself. She decided to return to Virginia, to see the plantation where she had been enslaved and where she had committed the act that had haunted her for 25 years. Mrs. Williamson tried to dissuade her, worried about the dangers a black woman would face traveling in the defeated and resentful South, but Dinah was determined. She needed to see the oak tree again, needed to confront the physical reality of what she had done now that she was free. The journey back to Virginia was nothing like her escape had been. Dinah traveled openly, a free woman with papers documenting her status. though those papers offered limited protection in a region where many white Southerners were enraged by their defeat and the loss of their enslaved labor force. She hired passage on coaches and trains, making her way south through a landscape transformed by war, past burned plantations and disrupted communities struggling to find a new order. Fletcher Plantation was much changed when Dinah arrived in the summer of 1866. William Fletcher had abandoned the property during the war, fleeing to South Carolina when Union troops approached. The grand house was burned, only the chimney and some walls remaining standing, a monument to the destruction of the old order. The fields were overgrown, the quarters were abandoned, and the whole property had the air of a place that had been reclaimed by nature. But the oak tree still stood, as imposing and ancient as ever, its branches spread wide over the yard where the main house had once stood. Dinah approached it slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and strange anticipation. She had dreamed of this tree countless times over the years, had seen Lawrence Fletcher's face staring up at her from beneath its roots in nightmares that woke her gasping and terrified. Now she stood before it in daylight, a free woman confronting the sight of her greatest crime and her desperate act of self-preservation. She placed her hand on the rough bark of the oak tree, feeling the solid reality of it beneath her palm. The tree had not changed, had not been affected by the war or the end of slavery or the passage of years. It had stood here for 2 centuries and would likely stand for 2 more, keeping its secrets in the earth beneath its roots. Dinah thought about Lawrence Fletcher's bones somewhere below, wondered if they were still there, or if the tree's roots had broken them apart and absorbed them, making his remains part of its ancient structure. As she stood there, an old man approached from the direction of what had been the quarters. He was formerly enslaved, one of the few who had remained on the property after emancipation because he had nowhere else to go. He recognized Dinah after a moment, his eyes widening with surprise that she had returned. They spoke for a while, sharing news of the intervening years, and the old man, whose name was Simon, told her that strange things still happened around the oak tree. Simon said that people still heard sounds coming from the tree at night, singing or crying that seemed to rise from deep in the earth. Some folks said it was the ghost of Lawrence Fletcher, trapped beneath the tree and unable to find peace. Others said it was all the souls who had suffered on the plantation, their voices joining together in a chorus of pain and endurance. Simon looked at Dinah carefully when he spoke, as if he suspected she knew more about the tree's secrets than she was saying, but he asked no direct questions. Dinah stayed near the plantation for several days, sleeping in the ruins of the quarters and spending her days walking the land that had been her prison for the first 15 years of her life. She visited the field where her mother had died, standing among the weeds that had overtaken what were once cotton rows. She walked through the burned ruins of the main house, seeing the fragments of the life the Fletcher family had lived on the backs of enslaved labor. And she returned again and again to the oak tree, drawn to it by forces she could not fully understand. On her last evening before returning to Philadelphia, Dinah stood beneath the oak tree as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. She spoke aloud to Lawrence Fletcher for the first time since the night she had buried him, her voice steady in the quiet evening air. She told him that she was not sorry for what she had done, that his death had been the price of her survival, that in a just world she would never have been forced to make such a choice. She told him that his violence had created the circumstances of his own death, that he had dug his own grave with every assault he committed. As she spoke, the wind picked up, rustling through the oak tree's leaves with a sound like distant voices. Dinah listened, trying to hear if there was anything in that sound beyond the natural movement of air through branches. She thought perhaps she heard something, a faint melody that might have been singing or might have been just the wind, but she could not be certain. The oak tree kept its secrets, as it had for 26 years, and Dinah realized that she was content to let it. She left Virginia the next morning, traveling north to Philadelphia and the life she had built as a free woman. She never returned to the plantation again, though she thought of the oak tree often in the years that followed. She continued her work with the abolitionist movement, which transformed into advocacy for the rights of formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. She spoke at meetings and churches, telling her story and demanding justice for those who had suffered under slavery. Dinah never married and never had children of her own. though she helped raise the children of other formerly enslaved people in the Philadelphia community. She worked for the Williamson family until Mrs. Williamson's death in 1878, then found other employment as a cook and housekeeper for various families. She lived simply, saving what money she could, always aware of how precarious freedom could be for black people in America, even after slavery's legal end. As Dinah grew older, she found herself thinking more about the nature of justice, and whether what she had done to Lawrence Fletcher could be justified. She had killed a man, had buried him alive beneath the oak tree, had listened to his screams as the earth filled his mouth and nose. By any legal standard, even one that recognized the humanity of enslaved people, she had committed murder. But by the standards of survival, of desperate self-defense against systematic violence, perhaps her act had been necessary and even right. She spoke to a minister about these thoughts once, a black preacher who had himself escaped slavery and understood the moral complexities of living under such an evil system. He told her that God judged the heart, that he understood the desperation that drove people to terrible acts when they were trapped in terrible circumstances. He told her that slavery was a sin so great that it corrupted everything it touched, forcing both enslaved and enslaver into moral positions that would never exist in a just world. His words brought Dinah some comfort, though they did not fully absolve the guilt she carried. In the 1880s, stories began to circulate from Virginia about the old Fletcher plantation and the haunted oak tree that stood on its grounds. The property had been subdivided and sold to various buyers after the war, but the section containing the oak tree remained undeveloped, considered cursed by locals who knew the stories. People reported seeing figures beneath the tree at night, hearing voices and screams coming from the ground, seeing lights that appeared and disappeared without source. Dinah heard these stories from travelers and from letters sent by people who knew of her connection to the plantation. Some sought her out specifically, having heard that she had been enslaved there and might know something about the mysteries surrounding the oak tree. She always denied knowledge of anything supernatural, saying only that the tree had stood on the plantation for as long as anyone could remember, and that enslaved people had told stories about it, as they told stories about many things, to make sense of their suffering. But privately, Dinah wondered if the stories were true, if Lawrence Fletcher's spirit truly was trapped beneath the oak tree, unable to find rest because of the violent nature of his death. She wondered if the singing people reported hearing was his voice, crying out from the earth for release or vengeance. Or perhaps the singing was the voices of all those who had suffered on the plantation, the generations of enslaved people whose pain had soaked into the soil and now expressed itself through the ancient tree that had witnessed it all. In 1892, when Dinah was 67 years old, she received word that the oak tree had been struck by lightning and split nearly in half. The strike had come during a violent thunderstorm, a bolt that had hit the tree with such force that it had split the trunk down to the roots, exposing the interior of the tree and the ground beneath it. Investigators examining the damage had found fragments of bone and rotted cloth deep in the exposed earth, evidence that confirmed what many had long suspected, that someone else was buried beneath the tree besides Lawrence Fletcher. This discovery led to new excavations around the oak tree, and workers found the remains of at least 3 other bodies buried in the area, all of them showing signs of violent death. These were likely enslaved people who had been murdered on the plantation and buried in unmarked graves, their deaths unrecorded and unmourned by the official history of the place. The discovery brought renewed attention to the plantation's brutal history and to the stories of hauntings that surrounded the oak tree. Dinah read about these discoveries in the newspapers, feeling a complex mix of emotions. The revelation of the other bodies meant that Lawrence Fletcher's grave was no longer unique, that he was buried among the victims of the plantation's violence rather than being its only mysterious death. There was a certain justice in that, Lawrence Fletcher's bones mingling with the remains of those his family had enslaved and murdered, all of them forgotten beneath the oak tree until lightning had exposed their resting place. The newspapers speculated about who these other people were and how they had died, but there were no records to identify them or explain their presence beneath the tree. They became known simply as the lost souls of Fletcher Plantation, unidentified victims of slavery's violence, who were finally acknowledged decades after their deaths. Some people called for the remains to be given proper burial, while others argued they should be left as they were found, a memorial to the horrors of slavery and the very earth that had witnessed it. Dinah never revealed what she knew about Lawrence Fletcher's death, never came forward to explain how at least one of those bodies had come to be beneath the oak tree. Her secret remained her own, carried through decades of freedom and advocacy and life lived beyond the bounds of slavery. She had survived when survival seemed impossible, had taken desperate action to end her suffering, and had lived to see the institution that had enslaved her destroyed. That was enough. In her final years, Dinah lived in a small apartment in Philadelphia, supported by a small pension she received for her work with various charitable organizations. She spent her days reading, attending church services, and visiting with the community of formerly enslaved people who had built lives in the city. She was respected as an elder, someone who had survived slavery and who could speak to the younger generations about the realities of that experience. Dinah died in her sleep in 1898, at the age of 73. She was buried in a cemetery for Black residents of Philadelphia, her grave marked with a simple stone that gave her name and dates, but said nothing of the extraordinary life she had lived, or the terrible choice she had been forced to make. Her funeral was attended by dozens of people from the community, people who knew her as a survivor, an advocate, and a link to a past that must be remembered even as they worked to build a better future. The oak tree on the old Fletcher plantation eventually died, the lightning strike having damaged it too severely to recover. It stood for a few more years as a dead monument, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers, before finally falling in a storm in 1903. The property owners cut up what remained and cleared the land, ending the physical presence of the tree that had stood for over 2 centuries and held so many secrets in its roots. But the stories about the oak tree persisted and grew, becoming part of the local folklore of that part of Virginia. People told of the singing tree, of the voices that rose from the earth where it had stood, of the souls trapped beneath its roots, seeking justice or peace. Some versions of the story focused on Lawrence Fletcher, the young master mysteriously killed and buried beneath the tree. Other versions spoke of the unnamed enslaved people whose remains had been found there, victims of a system that treated them as less than human. Few versions of the story mentioned Dinah by name, and none knew the truth of what she had done that night in July of 1840. Her act of desperate self-defense remained hidden, known only to her, and perhaps suspected by a few who had known her on the plantation. In the grand narrative of Fletcher Plantation's history, Dinah was just another enslaved girl, one of dozens who had worked there and whose individual stories were lost to time and lack of documentation. But in the smaller circles of formerly enslaved people and their descendants, whispered stories passed down through generations, there was sometimes mentioned a girl who had fought back, who had ended the assaults of a master's son through courage and terrible necessity. These stories never gave names or specific details, but they carried a message that resonated through the generations. That enslaved people had not been passive victims, that they had resisted in whatever ways they could, that survival sometimes required acts of violence that could not be judged by normal moral standards. The land where Fletcher Plantation once stood is now subdivided into small farms and residential properties, with nothing remaining of the grand house or the quarters or the fields that once produced tobacco and cotton. Through enslaved labor, the spot where the oak tree stood is marked only by a depression in the earth, a shallow bowl where the tree's massive root system once spread. Local historians have placed a marker there, noting that human remains were found at this location and that the site serves as a reminder of slavery's violence and the people who suffered under it. Sometimes people visit the site, drawn by the stories of the haunted oak tree and the mysteries of Fletcher Plantation. They stand at the depression where the tree once grew and listen to the wind moving through the smaller trees that have grown up around the area. Some claim they still hear singing, voices rising from the earth in songs of sorrow and endurance. Others hear nothing but the normal sounds of the countryside, wind and birds, and the distant noise of traffic on modern roads. Whether the singing is real or imagined, whether the spirits of those buried beneath the oak tree truly linger or have found their rest, the stories persist as testimony to what happened in that place. They speak of the violence of slavery, of the people who suffered under it, and of the desperate measures some took to survive and resist. They speak of Lawrence Fletcher, who believed his position gave him the right to violate the people his family enslaved, and who died buried alive beneath the tree that had watched over his family's plantation. And they speak, in whispered fragments passed through generations, of a girl named Dinah who refused to remain a victim, who took the terrible step of murder to end her suffering, and who lived to see freedom come to the nation. That had enslaved her. Her story, like those of so many enslaved people, was not recorded in official histories or preserved in archives. It lived instead in oral traditions, in stories told and retold, in the memory of communities who understood that survival under slavery sometimes required becoming what the system had tried to make you. A person capable of violence in the face of unrelenting violence. The oak tree is gone. Lawrence Fletcher's bones have been moved to the family plot where they rest among his ancestors, and the other remains found beneath the tree have been reburied in a cemetery with a memorial acknowledging them as victims of slavery. Dinah Green's bones rest in Philadelphia, far from the Virginia soil where she was born and enslaved, and where she committed the act that defined her life. But the stories remain, passed down through time, transformed and elaborated, but carrying at their core a truth about the nature of slavery and resistance. In the end, the question of whether Dinah was a murderer or a survivor, whether her act was criminal or defensive, cannot be answered within the moral framework of a society built on slavery. She was a 15-year-old girl being repeatedly assaulted by a man who had absolute power over her life, who existed within a system that denied her humanity and gave her no legal recourse, no protection, no hope of justice. What she did to Lawrence Fletcher was both murder and self-defense, both a crime and an act of desperate resistance, both terrible and necessary. The oak tree witnessed her acts and kept her secret for over 26 years, and even after the tree fell and the truth of the graves beneath it was partially revealed, Dinah's specific role in Lawrence Fletcher's death remained hidden. She carried that secret through her escape to freedom, through her work as an abolitionist, through her long life in Philadelphia, and she took it with her to the grave. It was her burden and her survival, her guilt and her triumph, the price she paid and the victory she won in a world that sought to destroy her. And on quiet nights in that part of Virginia, when the wind blows through the trees that have grown where the ancient oak once stood, some people still claim to hear singing rising from the earth. Whether it is the voice of Lawrence Fletcher crying out from his disturbed grave, or the voices of the enslaved people whose suffering soaked into that soil, or simply the sound of wind through leaves, the singing continues. It speaks of pain and endurance, of violence and resistance, of a history that cannot be buried no matter how deep the graves are dug or how much time passes. Dinah Green's story, like the story of slavery itself, is one that must be remembered and reckoned with, not hidden or sanitized, but confronted in all its complexity and horror. She was a victim and a killer, a survivor and a murderer, a girl destroyed by slavery and a woman who fought back in the only way she could. Her act beneath the oak tree was both an individual tragedy and a small rebellion against a system of oppression that ground human beings into dust. The oak tree is gone, but its legacy remains, a reminder that history is written not just in official records and grand narratives, but in the stories of individuals who made impossible choices in impossible situations. Dinah Green made her choice on a summer night in 1840, and she lived with the consequences for the rest of her life. Her story, told here in full for the first time, stands as testimony to what slavery was and what it drove people to do, and to the truth that sometimes survival requires becoming what we fear, and that the line between justice and vengeance is drawn by those who hold the power to define it.